All right, James, do you want to start? We're ready.
Sure. All right. Well, I'd like to now call the November 16th, 2022 Longmont Sustainability Advisory Board meeting to order. Will you please start with a roll call?
Yes, Jim Metcalf,
I am present.
Michelle Roth,
Present.
Charles Musgrave,
Present.
Robert Davidson,
Here.
Ralph Grosswald,
Present.
Lisa Knobloch,
Here.
Becky Doyle,
Here.
Nancy Jaffe is joining us. Debbie Seidman will be here later. Jose Luis Ramos. He is here. And we have Zach Lance with us. Daryl Hahn. And Susan Bartlett is coming in right now, and Heather McIntyre's here, still waiting on Councilmember Martin, but we do have a quorum.
Wonderful. We have a quorum. All right. Item 4 is our land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge that Longmont sits on the traditional territory of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and other indigenous peoples. We honor the history and the living and spiritual connection that the first peoples have with this land. It is our commitment to face the injustices that happened when the land was taken, and to educate our communities, ourselves, and our children to ensure that these injustices do not happen again. All right, our first item of business is to approve the minutes from last meeting. If anybody has any corrections or amendments they would like to add to the minutes, this would be the time. Otherwise, we can get a motion to approve.
I'll move that we approve the meetings from last month's board meeting.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
5 for 5. All right. The agenda revisions, submission of documents. Do the staff have anything that they'd like to revise or submit for today's meeting?
Nope.
All right, we're good. So we are on to general business. So I just want to remind everybody to please hold comments and questions until the end of each presentation. So we're going to have 2 presentations. First will be a pollinator presentation, and then review. Then we'll be reviewing draft components of the Universal Recycling Ordinance. So at the end of each one of those would be the time that we would ask our questions. So I believe we can go ahead and start with our pollinator presentation from Jim Crick.
Hello, my name's Jim Crick, and I'm the Ecosystem Management Administrator for the Parks and Natural Resources Division. And just want to thank Sustainability Advisory Board for inviting me this afternoon to talk about what Longmont does to benefit pollinators, and more specifically, what our Parks and Natural Resources Division is doing and has been doing to benefit pollinators. So Heather, if you wouldn't mind bringing up the presentation. All right, thank you. And you can go to the next slide. So just outline of what I'll be talking about today. I'll be going over the importance of pollinators, what kind of diversity that we have in Colorado, and then I'll be going over those specific actions that we take to benefit pollinators. Next slide, please. So I think we probably are all familiar with how important pollinators are. They've kind of been a really important topic in the conservation world for quite a few years lately. But just to refresh people's memory, and maybe you might learn something new, 85% of our flowering plants require animal pollination. So quite a few of our plants require that. 35% of our crops that we depend on for food are animal pollinated. And then pollinators also provide food in our food web, whether that's indirectly by the fruits and seeds that they help produce, or directly. For example, 89% of our birds depend on pollinators for feeding. And there's a great photo there of American robin feeding their young, but you'll see a lot of birds collecting by the mouthful like that, a lot of different pollinators. Next slide, please. So as far as diversity goes, Colorado, we're all familiar that we've got quite a diverse range of different habitats in Colorado, from the plains all the way up to the alpine tundra. So because of this really great diversity of different types of habitats that we have in Colorado. We have some of the greatest diversity in pollinators within the country. We've got 946 species of native bees in Colorado. 552 of those alone are in Boulder County. So Boulder County in particular is kind of a hotbed for pollinators and bees. There's 250 different species of butterflies. Amazingly, greater than 1,000 species of moths in Colorado. And we also have a whole suite of wasps, beetles, flies, hummingbirds that also contribute to pollination of plants. And there's some photos of some different examples. We've got a wasp there on a Colorado butterfly plant, and that is a rabbit brush beetle that you'll find a lot on our native rabbit brush that we have around. Next slide, please. So just want to start off with pollinators have definitely been in the news and in the front of our minds in Parks and Natural Resources in terms of conservation. I think it's pretty well known that pollinators are facing a lot of threats, and there are some good documentation of declines in pollinators. But particularly in Colorado, I did want to try to put into focus some of what our pollinators and particularly our bees are dealing with in Boulder County. In 2009, two researchers from CU Boulder, Kearns and Oliveris, they reported on a project that they were doing. In 1907, there was actually a gentleman that did an inventory of bees in Colorado. He was able to locate and document 116 species in Boulder County. And so Kearns and Oliveris, they wanted to try to replicate that project and see how many they could find about a century later. And so out of those 116 species that they found in the grasslands of Boulder County, Kearns and Oliveris were able to document 110 of those. So within a century, there's still 110, at least in this one effort, of the 116 species still existing in Boulder County. And so with that project, they stated, and I quote, "We conclude that the bees of the grasslands of Boulder County have been largely conserved, and we hypothesize that the large amount of the preserved habitat in the county has contributed to maintaining these insects." So overall, as in terms of species richness, which is the number of different species of bees, we're still doing pretty good. But I'll talk a little bit more about as far as abundance and how those populations are doing. I think there's still some questions that we are looking to try to answer. So anyway, going into the threats that our pollinators are facing, we've got several threats that are pretty prominent for pollinators. Habitat loss being the #1 threat to our pollinators and really to wildlife in general. So that can be habitat loss, fragmentation, degradation, and a lot of that, unfortunately, is due to humans. Urbanization, like the background photo here, this is actually a neighborhood, fairly new neighborhood in the southwest part of Longmont, is a big contributor to that loss of habitat. And also agriculture is another prime one too. I think you're all aware of agricultural operations being pretty monotypic with, just one species being farmed at a time. So that can contribute to some of the habitat loss as well. But that's not to say that some of this development is not totally incompatible with pollinators. We can create habitat within these developments and within agriculture. You can see on this background photo, a lot of the green there is just bluegrass turf. We're hoping to make efforts to try to educate people and also to provide some incentives and potentially even changes of code that will meet multiple benefits, not just for pollinator habitat, but also water conservation, of trying to convert more of this turf that might not really be utilized very much into either low water use landscaping or even pollinator type habitat landscaping as well. It's just a lot of green bluegrass that really, from a pollinator perspective, might as well be concrete. We can create these habitats within these types of environments. It just takes a more education and really just a different mindset of as far as what is acceptable landscaping for people. I think that's something that's really starting to become more prevalent, particularly in Colorado with our water conservation needs. So we can get multiple benefits by meeting water conservation needs by also trying to create some pollinator habitat at the same time. Another impact that we have is climate change, and that is a direct effect on habitat as well. For instance, a lot of pollinators that are in higher elevations that are more adapted to cooler climates. As climate change creates warmer climates, those species really, you can only go so high. And that higher temperatures creep up into the higher elevations, and those species kind of get squeezed out. A really good example, not from a pollinator perspective, if you haven't heard, is the threats that the pika are facing in our Colorado mountains. They're really dependent on colder climates, and they're really starting to run out of space where they can actually find that colder climate as climate change progresses. Climate change is also potentially creating kind of a disjunction with pollinators between timing of flowering of plants and the emergence of pollinators, whether that is plants are flowering earlier before pollinators are emerging to take advantage of those, or vice versa, where pollinators might be emerging earlier in the season before there are flowering resources for them to take advantage of. And that's really critical in the spring as they're just getting started. If you can kind of envision it just like a bear waking up from hibernation, they're pretty low on energy and they need to get some quick energy right away. So if there is that disjunction, that's obviously going to affect survivability of pollinators, particularly bees. Invasive plants and non-native competition is also a really big driver for declines in pollinators. Invasive plants, I'm sure you all know, really outcompete a lot of native vegetation that our native pollinators have evolved with. And so when we lose native flowering plants to weedy species, they may not be able to provide the pollen and nectar resources that certain species may be dependent upon. Besides invasive plants, we also have European honeybees, which more and more research is showing directly affect the survivability, particularly of our native bees. One honeybee hive consumes the same pollen as 100,000 solitary native bees. So that's quite a big impact. And based off of that number, it's been determined that in Colorado alone, European honeybees consume the equivalent of 4 billion native bees. So that's quite the impacts. So combine that competition with the effects that we have of invasive plant species and loss of habitat. So we already have a scarce native flowering resource for native pollinators. You combine that with honeybees and it gets even harder. Along with the European honeybees, direct competition is that they also are being shown to transfer parasites and diseases to wild populations of native bees as well. So that's quite a concern too. I don't know if you all did your homework and watched the YouTube video that I sent a link for. Yeah, I see one, great. I thought that was just a really outstanding presentation by one of our local experts on pollinators. And one of the drivers that he hit home on in his presentation is that one of the issues that we have is we don't have enough data to really know what is going on out there. You know, we can surmise by all these threats that, yes, we are seeing declines in populations, and for specific species, we may be seeing declines and have that data. But overall, with, you know, those 500 plus species in Boulder County, we probably don't have a lot of data on all those species as far as where they are they surviving these threats? Is their habitat shrinking? So really, that's one of the hardest things for us as wildlife conservationists and land managers is having the data to know what we need to put our efforts to. And when we do put our efforts towards conservation, are those efforts making a difference or not? So that's one of the most difficult things as conservationists that we have is not having enough data. And then also insecticides, I think we're all familiar with, are being documented to have an impact on pollinators, particularly the neonicotinoids have been in the news for a while now. It's pretty well documented that they do have negative impacts, particularly on managed honeybees and bumblebees. But like I said, with the lack of data, we can surmise that yes, there's a little bit of research showing impacts to native populations. Some of that research has been done in laboratory settings, so not quite the same as studying out in the wild. But it is definitely possible that those neonicotinoids and other insecticides are impacting wild populations as well. So we want to be careful with how insecticides and other pesticides are being used. Next slide, please. So I want to start jumping into some of the actions that Parks and Natural Resources has been taking and continues to take to help conserve our pollinators. And one of the biggest things that we do is to conserve pollinators is to conserve, enhance, and create habitat. Like I said, that loss of habitat is our biggest threat. And so that's where we put a lot of our efforts into is to create better habitat. So here's kind of some examples in these photos. The one on the left is after we did a seed collection for some, I think that was a currant species, a wax currant up at Button Rock. We did some berry collection. And then we will use those berries to actually grow out some of these shrubs and other flowering plants that we can then put back onto the landscape. So this is some of our outstanding volunteers that helped us pot up some of the shrubs that we've had grown out. And then that last photo there is of behind our shop yard at Sunset Campus here. We have a nursery that we are continuing to develop. So this is a shade structure where we put young plants to keep them out of the direct sunlight so that they grow a little bit better. We are about 2 weeks away from actually completing a greenhouse at our facility. And so our hope is that we can kind of be a little bit more self-sufficient in growing out these plants. A lot of the plants will send off the seed to nurseries to grow out, and then we'll pick them up later on. So we're hoping to be able to start doing a lot of that ourselves. One of the difficulties that we have in finding native plants is a lot of nurseries just don't carry the plants that we're looking for. And when they do carry some of these plants, they aren't what we call ecotypic. And what I mean by ecotypic is that they have the genetics of the local plants that have evolved with our climate. So you can get, different species of plants that might have been grown from, say, Minnesota, and you can imagine that their climate is quite different than ours here. So they might not be able to survive long-term on the landscape. So we're looking to try to collect native seed locally and grow those out and have a better chance of those plants surviving long-term. Next slide. So this is some examples of some of our plantings. On the left here, this is a portion of the Resilient St. Vrain project. And some of those plants in this photo, we actually collected seed for. We've got swamp milkweed, Nuttall sunflower, and verbena, which we all had local collections for. And we sent those to a nursery that grew out all these wetland plugs for us and brought them back to us when they grew them out. And then we planted them on Resilient St. Vrain. So that's a great example of kind of the full circle process for us. And then on the right there, some other great volunteers that helped us plant a bunch of riparian flowering shrubs out at the shoreline of Lake McIntosh, which we continue to work on today. Next slide. Some of our other actions that we take, some more awesome volunteers. I just want to keep plugging our volunteer program. We have a great volunteer program, and a lot of the projects that we do, we couldn't do without our volunteers. So definitely check out our volunteer program and sign up if you're interested. But on the left there is a weed pull event that we had up at Button Rock. So we like to use what's called integrated weed management and try to utilize a bunch of different methods of weed control. And so hand pulling weeds with shovels and just good old women and manpower is a great way to do that. And then on the right there is another volunteer helping us create nesting habitat for cavity nesting bees. We basically have cut logs and they just drilled specific sized holes to a specific depth in the logs, and then we put them out on our open spaces, and cavity nesting bees take to them pretty quickly. So it's a pretty easy and a fun project for, as you can see here, kids can help out with it. Next slide, please. So going into some of the policy work that we've been doing. In 2017, Longmont City Council adopted a pollinator resolution, and that really just outlines a lot of the actions that I've been talking about and we'll talk about that we take to try to protect pollinators. It includes a commitment by us to reduce our pesticide use, including neonicotinoids, which at this time, City of Longmont does not use neonicotinoids. It's really, neonics have been used mostly for protecting ash trees from emerald ash borer. But our city forester has found alternatives using neonicotinoids for protecting our ash trees at this time. So along with that reduction in pesticide use, I was talking with our park staff, and our parks operations, they've significantly reduced their herbicide use. Traditionally in the past, they had been applying herbicide to our turf parks in the spring and in the fall pretty regularly. But in the past 6 years, they've completely stopped using pesticides in playgrounds to protect children. And they have, in this past 6 years, they haven't had the need to actually do any weed spraying in any of the turf grass parks. That's about 300 acres of our turf grass. They've really been able to do that because they focused a lot on cultural methods of creating really healthy turf grass by proper watering, very limited use of organic fertilizers, mowing at proper heights. And so they've been able to create really healthy turf grass, and that's really your best defense against weeds is healthy competitive vegetation. And so they've been able to significantly reduce their herbicide use, which is really great. So we also, I mentioned that we have a integrated weed management plan for our Parks and Natural Resources Division, and that really just outlines how we work to use multiple methods of weed control, whether it's mechanical, cultural methods, biological methods in instances. And then when we do deem that it is necessary to use herbicides, it outlines how we use those as responsibly as we can, taking into consideration public health, environmental health, applicator safety, but also taking into consideration the available resources that we have in terms of staff and budget too. So some of those policies for our use of pesticides includes that we spot spray almost all of our weeds whenever possible. All of our applicators that work for the city, whether that's staff or contractors, are licensed by the state to apply pesticides. And we also are committed to using the least toxic herbicides at the lowest recommended rates that are effective in controlling the weeds. So those are some of the specific policies that we take, but we have a whole suite of those that include also how we notify the public of when we apply herbicides as well. In this background photo here is an example of one of our other policies. We have a mowing standard that we follow that our city staff as well as contractors follow specifically for our greenways. In the past, it is pretty common for not just Longmont, but a lot of communities in these greenways to just mow all the vegetation from sidewalk to irrigation ditch to creek edge. We recognize that was a really honestly a bad practice to do and not a best management practice. So our mowing standards now are to kind of mow a swath along the edges of the trails and leaving that vegetation tall between the trail and the waterway, whether that's an irrigation ditch or a natural stream corridor. And so that creates a lot of multiple benefits. One, it allows vegetation and native flowering plants to actually grow and produce flowers instead of getting continually mowed. But it also conserves water. It helps fight weeds. Like I said, healthy vegetation that's allowed to grow densely is competitive against weeds. And it also helps filter on the left side, you can kind of see a fence line there. A lot of our greenways are bordered by backyards. And so having that vegetation helps filter, any other herbicides or pesticides from drifting from somebody's backyard and flowing through runoff into our waterways. Another policy that we're taking, that we're actively working on right now is amending the city's weed control ordinance. The current weed control ordinance, how do I want to say it? It kind of doesn't give a lot of difference between noxious weeds and say like dandelions. And so that's something that we've heard from the public and a lot of our pollinator advocates is that they'd like to see the city not focus so much on requiring people to control dandelions. So like I mentioned in the early spring, dandelions are one of the first flowering plants. Even though they aren't native, they are one of the earliest ones that flower to provide that first boost of energy to our pollinators. And so we want to try to take some of the focus from totally having people remove every single dandelion in the landscape. They're really kind of more of a nuisance. They don't provide or don't create the same impacts that our state listed noxious weeds do. And so we're working to amend our weed code to put more emphasis on our state listed noxious weeds for control on public or private property, rather than kind of more nuisance weeds like dandelions. So hopefully the amendments that we're working on will give our code enforcement a little bit more leeway and when they enforce that on kind of these lesser impactful weeds. And also using that code amendment to allow people to create more native habitat in their yards and allow vegetation to grow tall and kind of mimic native habitat. Next slide, please. So I want to talk too about some of the research actions that we've been taking. So like I mentioned, that lack of data is kind of detrimental to us taking sound scientific management actions. And so an example of one of the research projects that we funded, we have an annual funded research grant that we provide up to $10,000 to third parties to conduct research on city property. And one of them that we funded in 2020 was a continuation of some research that has been going on city property. It just so happened in 2012, before the flood, that these researchers had been going out and documenting bee species along the St. Vrain corridor from the west side of town all the way out to Sandstone Ranch on the east side. And then the flood happened. And so they got a great idea of, hey, let's try to see what impacts the flood had on native bees along the St. Vrain corridor. So they continued that research, I think is in 2014 or 15. They went out and inventoried again, and they definitely saw some negative impacts and reductions in species richness along the St. Vrain corridor. But then they went back out in 2020 after we funded continuation of the project, and they are seeing a recovery of native bees along the St. Vrain corridor. So that's great news and kind of shows the resiliency of our native bees in particular. But there's a lot of other research that has been going on, not just City of Longmont funded, but also some of our neighboring agencies like Boulder County Parks and Open Space and City of Boulder. They also have small grant programs for research, and they've been doing some great pollinator research as well. For instance, Boulder County funded a study that showed that leaving downed wood along riparian corridors, this is another post-flood study, is really beneficial for cavity nesting bees. Not surprising really, because those cavity nesting bees need that dead down wood to create cavities to nest in. Another study that they did too was showing that a specific herbicide called indaziflam that we use for controlling cheatgrass on our landscapes, after applying that cheatgrass, it releases a lot of native flowering species that have been laying dormant and crowded out by that cheatgrass. And because of that, they're showing that after that herbicide application, that there is an increase in pollinator diversity on those landscapes. So that's kind of an example of, hey, we're doing these management actions. What kind of effects are they having? And cheatgrass control is one of the major management actions that we have been undertaking for a variety of reasons, not just ecological impacts, but cheatgrass also creates fire hazards, which has been prominent lately too. Another study that we did do, I believe was in I want to say 17, if I remember right. We did hire a consultant. We were interested in seeing the effects of effectiveness of organic herbicides compared to using glyphosate. So we did a study along the right of way on 21st Street in town, and we were using an evaluation system developed by Cornell that evaluates herbicide use and how I guess safe they are to apply, if you want to say it that way, whether it's environmentally or to people. And they evaluate it based on not just the toxicity of the herbicide in general, but a lot of herbicides, particularly organic herbicides, you have to repeatedly apply them quite a bit to really get any effect on them. And because of that repeated application, this study found that a lot of those organic herbicides are actually more detrimental to people in the environment than glyphosate would be. Just because you have to apply it quite a bit. A lot of those organic herbicides, even though they're organic, can actually be pretty dangerous for people. For example, acetic acid, which is the horticultural vinegar is another name for it. Talking with a retired weed researcher up at CSU, they were testing it out on a study, and it's the only herbicide that they ever had to stop using and stop the study, because even with a respirator on, it was burning their lungs. So even though some of these herbicides are organic and people like to say that they're safer, that's not necessarily the case. And so that's what we found with this study. And we also found that because you have to repeatedly apply these, it costs more to do it. And just in general, the control effectiveness was quite a bit less too. And besides any of the research, our staff regularly attends trainings and conferences about pollinators. There was one recently that the People and Pollinators Action Network, a local pollinator advocacy group, helps host with the Butterfly Pavilion. But we also attended a couple of years ago a training held by the Xerxes Society that Boulder County Parks and Open Space helped host, that helped train us on what we can do for land management and particularly agriculture to help benefit pollinators. Next slide, please. And so lastly, just want to go over some of our planned future actions that we're going to take. Our park staff has been actively working on some test plots on turf conversion. And so we want to try to convert some of this underutilized bluegrass turf into low water use vegetation and even some more pollinator friendly landscaping as well. And so the next step would be to create an overall turf conversion plan for city properties. And so that will be in the works. We're just working on trying to figure out how that fits into people's workloads and finding funding to do that plan. Our ecosystem management work group, we have a long-term goal of creating stewardship plans for our properties. And so a stewardship plan will help us evaluate what kind of habitat we have on our property, say Sandstone Ranch nature area. What's our current condition with our habitat? And then what is the potential for that habitat? And what can we do to enhance that habitat for not just pollinators, but all wildlife? So we want to create these types of stewardship plans for all of our properties to help guide our management actions. We've also got two xeric demonstration gardens that will be constructed next year. One's at Rogers Grove Nature Area and one is at Sandstone Ranch. And part of those demonstration gardens will be pollinator habitat as well. So public can go and visit those and get some ideas on what they might be able to incorporate either at their homes or at their businesses. And then we're also looking and continue to look for opportunities to create habitat at our agricultural properties. Like I mentioned, agriculture on its own is not necessarily incompatible with pollinators. It's just a matter of incorporating that habitat into kind of the underutilized, unproductive portions of ag properties. So like those corners that a 7-pivot irrigation system can't reach, that tend to be kind of weedy, we can look to try to convert those into more native habitat. And so with that, I appreciate your time and listening, and I have time for questions or do I have time for questions?
Yes, you do. And thank you very much.
Yeah.
That was great. Are there questions? Kathleen?
I had a question.
Oh, sorry. I'll go in the order that I see them. Is Kathleen Sands available too?
So Kathleen is one of our community members. Do you want to just wait until public invited?
Okay. Okay. So Kathleen, we'll let you ask your question in a little bit. So I'm going to go to Michelle.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering about the new development. Is there anything that the city is able to do to kind of build in new like laws for codes for like new housing developments if pollinators are a factor in the landscape or vegetation or disruption of pollinators from those areas?
Sure. So current development code, there are some portions of the development code that aren't specifically for pollinators, but just for wildlife conservation and habitat conservation. So every development that comes in is evaluated to see if they're required to create what's called a species and habitat conservation plan. So if a project is proposed and our staff takes a look at it and we say, hey, looks like there might actually be, if it's a green field that's getting developed, we'll take a look and say, hey, you might have some potential habitat on that property. Can you submit this plan and hire a biologist to evaluate the habitat and species that might be existing on the property? And if there are species such as raptors, wetlands, anything like that, then there are to create kind of mitigation steps for how to protect those. There are also a portion of the plan that or the code that requires developers to take a look at if they have significant native habitat, how they are going to try to conserve that to the best that they can. Another portion of the development code is the riparian setback. So all of our stream systems throughout the city have a setback from them. Some of the more major stream systems like the St. Vrain is 150-foot setback, and some of the more minor stream corridors are about 100 feet. And there's also a 100-foot setback that developers have to abide by for wetlands as well. If they do want to encroach on that setback, they do have to submit a variance, and part of that process is doing a what's called a sustainability evaluation system. And so they look at all the impacts that encroaching on that setback may have and try to show how they mitigate that. So an example might be they are looking to encroach on that setback by, say, 10 feet, something like that. And they can maybe mitigate that impact by helping enhance that riparian corridor, by helping plant more native species that they might not otherwise be required to. So that's some of the ways that development code currently helps protect habitat and I guess indirectly for pollinators. But I think there is always opportunity with any city code for updating it if the community feels like they want either more stringent guidelines or just more specific guidelines to protect or do whatever it is that they feel that development should be doing. So there's always that opportunity, and it's something that the city kind of regularly between work groups has discussions on. Hey, are there code updates? Like I mentioned with our weed control code, we were taking a look at that and said, you know what, this isn't really meeting what we're hearing from what the community is telling us that they want to see with our weed control code. So we want to update that.
Great. Ralph, I believe you're next.
You're muted, Ralph.
You're still muted.
Sorry. Thank you very much for this presentation, which is incredibly dense, really, with the information and things to think about. I noticed in the threats section that you didn't address or have on your list, this somewhat controversial area of RF or cell towers, this sort of thing, and how they affect pollinators. And I'm really happy to have a professional environmental conservationist who could maybe give us some reflection in the field and away from the the discussions online and that sort of thing. What's the general thinking and level of objective data that you're aware of regarding the impact of these kinds of things on pollinators?
Yeah, I guess the general feeling right now is just like I said, with a lot of it, there's not quite enough data to be conclusive on effects. So in these kind of instances, we just continue to try to collect more data. We rely on some of our federal and state agencies that really have a little bit more expertise and scientific knowledge in these areas and try to follow their lead. We do the same thing with pesticide use, where the federal government and state government is responsible for regulating those and doing the research and looking into the whole breadth of knowledge and research. They can do that a lot better than I can, of going to Google and trying to find what scholarly articles that we can. As much as we do try to keep up on with that, we do rely on some of these other federal and state agencies to help guide what is actually happening out there, and trying to rely on them to have evaluated the whole breadth of research that is going on. But at this point, my understanding is that there's still a lot more research that needs to be done.
I believe Councilmember Martin is next.
Yes, thank you. I had something to add to the answer to the last question, which is about code updates and what could the city do to make Longmont a more pollinator-friendly place and just have better habitat. And unfortunately, there are some limits on what the city can do because the state statutes regulate pesticides and preempt a municipality from passing regulations of their own. So Longmont can adopt policies, which we heard about, and they're pretty good policies. They walk the fine line between keeping people safe from mosquitoes carrying scary diseases and not being dangerous to pollinators. And we can use that on city maintained land, which is a big portion of the land. And we can educate the public who has proven to be pretty receptive in not using hairy, scary chemicals. But the place in between are the homeowners associations, who they're a separate jurisdiction from the city, and their rulings are separate and above ours because that's the way state law works. So we can recommend that they don't use this or that chemical, but if they want to, they can. Just recently, state law was changed so that people who live in an HOA can xeriscape their own yards, but there's nothing anybody can do to make the homeowners association xeriscape its own open space. So that's really a limit that I'd like everybody to know about, because if you have any contact with your state legislators, and especially with Senator Sonia Jaquez Lewis, who is interested in this matter, just tell them this is one place where local control would mean a lot. And if Longmont could have ordinances about pesticides and herbicides, and if they could apply to the HOAs, that would really improve Longmont as safe habitat. That's it.
Thank you very much. Charles.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that presentation. It was super educational, so appreciated that.
Welcome.
I had a question. Maybe I kind of missed this, but how similar is the swapping out the turf, Kentucky bluegrass, et cetera, to this new landscaping to xeriscaping? One thing I was wondering about is because Denver Water was kind of a pioneer in developing xeriscaping. And so we probably have a lot of local data and expertise in that. And I don't know if we leverage that or not, but I wasn't sure, it's just basically how similar this new new landscaping the city's putting in to xeriscaping.
Yeah, we're looking at a kind of a spectrum of different types of alternative turf methods. And I guess the first address, you mentioned, Denver Water, and we've got, contacts with Northern Water and St. Frank Left-Hand Water Conservancy District. There definitely are a lot of people, a lot of experts in Colorado that have been doing this, that we're not trying to recreate the wheel. We're trying to implement kind of some of the strategies that other people have tried and seen how it works here in Longmont. So as far as different methods, we're looking at everything from a spectrum of our parks staff actually converted outside of our service center building. They converted an area of bluegrass turf to, when you look at it, when I looked at it, I was like, isn't that I don't see any difference. And it's actually a mixture of some different types of wheatgrasses and some other species. Looks like a great turf lawn, but uses 50% less water. And because of that, it requires much less mowing, which is great for the climate as well, because you don't have those emissions going out, and less fertilizer. So there's kind of that spectrum. And then you can even go to extreme for xeriscaping and have kind of what a lot of people picture xeriscaping of being kind of some rocks and some really drought tolerant plants and that kind of thing. So we're looking at the spectrum of different types of techniques. And part of that turf conversion plan that we want to work on would take a look at where are those different techniques most appropriate to be used. So each of those kind of techniques take either more maintenance, more effort, more resources. So even though that's kind of more rocky, more traditional kind of thought of xeric landscape, may use the least amount of water, but it tends to take a lot of maintenance too. Whereas on the other side, that alternative turf that uses 50% less water, which is still significant, might take less input. One of the other things to consider too with these conversions is there aren't a lot of contractors that are around that know how to take care of some of these more plants centric, like shrubs and flowering plant centric types of landscapes compared to that more turf type where, hey, they're just looking at it, it's like, if I just have to water it less and mow it less, I know how to do that. But taking care of, say, if you even want to convert not just to a rock garden, but more of a prairie simulation, that takes a different type of expertise to take care of. And right now, there's not many companies, landscaping companies, that know how to do that. So that's a consideration as well.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had one question, actually. Again, I just like to echo everybody else. Thank you for that. So obviously the city controls the city, but a lot of the stats, like in the presentation that you sent us beforehand, which I also thought was really great, really informative, and some of the stats you threw out, it talks about a pollinator population in the county. And I'm kind of curious about like how much of the like pollinator populations are we going to be able to affect based on city regulations or policies or changes versus like the county-wide, especially the more open parts of open space or agricultural parts of the county. Is there a lot of room to make a lot of headway? And I mean, I like it. I've been planning on changing my lawns. Like I want to do all that stuff. I think those are all great ideas, but I'm just curious about the efficacy of it compared to kind of like the county-wide pollinator index.
Yeah, I guess, I know that our kind of neighboring agencies, particularly, Boulder County and City of Boulder, definitely are taking into consideration pollinators too. A lot of our open space agencies are pretty like-minded that way of just having a general goal of species conservation. So I know that those other agencies are working on this as well on their open space properties. I know City of Boulder in particular is working with a kind of a citizen-led initiative to come up with pollinator protection ways for City of Boulder too. So yeah, I guess it's kind of one of those things where it's, you can control what you can control. And so if City of Longmont can make impacts for a City of Longmont, you take a look at just the square footage of the entire footprint of the City of Longmont. That's pretty significant footprint that we might be able to have some impact on. Particularly if we do find ways to incentivize and get some more of this really underutilized turf converted into more pollinator type habitat. So I think we should still be focusing on what we can, and we do work across our boundaries with Boulder County. We actually have quarterly meetings with Boulder County and talk about initiatives that we can work on together. Another initiative that is being undertaken is, I don't know if you've noticed on the diagonal between Longmont and Boulder, there've kind of been some of these strips along the edge of the median in the grassy areas that has been, I guess for lack of a better term, kind of torn up a little bit. So what they're trying to do there, and they're working with some of these pollinator activists and with CDOT, is to evaluate the success of converting some of that just, and what it is actually pasture grasses that really don't provide a whole lot of pollinator habitat, and they're trying to convert that into more pollinator habitat and seeding flowering species in there, and trying to create this highway corridor of flowers and seeing how that works. So so we do work across boundaries as well, and try to create initiatives and not just look at our own footprint, but see what we can do to help each other out.
Yeah, that's great. One of the other corridors that I've always been really curious about is that I ride my bike a lot around the county, and there are these amazing gravel roads that go by all the ditches that have big signs telling me I can't ride my bike on them. But they are these kind of like paths that go through otherwise agricultural land in a lot of places that are right by, I mean, they're ditches, but they're still waterways. I've always wished that there was a way to access those as a cyclist because they would be wonderful, and they're graded and they're flat and it's great. But it seems like there could be other ways throughout the county to try to leverage some of these spaces that right now are really just, as far as I can see, rather bare. Obviously they need access to the ditches, you can't pull up the gravel roads and all that stuff. But I just wonder if it's good to hear that there are a lot of things that we're working with other agencies throughout the county, because it seems like there probably are a lot of pockets or corridors of land that could be improved in this manner.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really good idea of, how can we use ditch corridors? Like I mentioned with our mowing standards on our greenways and our long irrigation ditches in the city, I think we've seen just by changing our mowing standards, the benefits that we've had. I've seen a great increase in flowering native species along our ditches. So yeah, I think that's something that I'll bring back to our staff, and I'll bring to when we meet other agencies and see what their thoughts are on that. And I think we're always looking for opportunities to find ways that we can improve habitat.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. Are there any other questions from the board or the council member? Looks like we're happy and satisfied. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Our next item of business will be Lisa Knobloch, or Lisa K, according to my notes here, but I assume that's Lisa Knobloch.
Yes. Actually, I'm going to pass it over to Francie. She's going to take the lead on this one. And thank you, Jim. I want to say thanks, Jim, for that awesome presentation and the great questions and all the work that his group does over there. It's great.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Francie Jaffe, Sustainability Coordinator. So I will be walking through a summary of the Universal Recycling Ordinance proposal that we'll be discussing with council in December. And then also highlighting, we've been doing a lot of feedback with targeted community groups. So I'll be, hopefully I have access to share my screen, sharing that and walking through, and then we are hoping to receive board feedback that we can add to that to be part of our city council discussion. I also want to highlight that this is we've been talking about zero waste with the board throughout the year. In September, the zero waste resolution update did pass with city council. So this is the next step towards helping to implement implement and achieve the new targets that were set in that resolution. So, okay. So at the top, I just wanted to highlight the community engagement that we did to develop this draft. Throughout the year when we were developing the zero waste resolution, we met with different community partners, received feedback from the general community, this advisory board, as well as others. And then we did more targeted focus from late September to early November, specifically around the universal recycling ordinance. We had 6 focus groups focusing on businesses and multifamily tenants and commercial haulers. We stopped by 6 large multifamily property companies and talked to their property managers. We also received comments from communities from the event. So I wanted to highlight both because we did take in not just feedback from this short period of time, but we were asking about the components of the universal recycling ordinance all year. Before I dive into the scope, I just want to highlight what's not included in this ordinance that were included as potential action items in the zero waste resolution, and are areas that the city will still be looking towards, are just not within the scope. That includes recycling at city parks and composting at select locations, reevaluating city services. That includes reevaluating our pay-as-you-throw program and embedding compost fees. It does not address the upcoming House bill that will address plastic bags and styrofoam, diversion requirements for large special events, hard to recycle opportunities, source reduction, and construction and demolition. So these are still areas for the city to explore just outside of this proposal. So the 2 areas of this proposal, I will walk through, and then I'm going to try to, there's all these comments on the side. These are key comments we got from the community, so I'll try to highlight a couple of them. And I'm going to start with the commercial recycling proposal, and then we also have a commercial organics diversion proposal. So the basis of the commercial recycling proposal is all properties in the city of Longmont must have a recycling service. Businesses must subscribe to a recycling service and provide recycling collection containers that meet the level of generation, have signs in at least both English and Spanish with symbology and being ADA accessible. Do want to note that we have not fully, that there were comments about a desire to have some universal signage so that businesses are downloading the same signs that using the same signs that the city is using. So it's just consistency. And we still we need to still work with our partners like the Center for People with Disabilities or other partners to understand what that ADA accessibility could look like for bins, and then train employees on proper sorting. Education throughout the entire year was the #1 comment we got, the need for more education. And we also got there would need to be a lot of assistance because employers are not going to know what to educate their employees on. So if there could be that assistance. Similar requirements for a multifamily property, although we did add convenient access to recycling and shared spaces and when dumpsters are located. Again, providing that information as well as that consistent signage. So As this is going for discussion with City Council, this entire timeline might change, but this is just a starting point. Having a 1-year education period and process for exemptions to begin in June, that gives the city more time. We've heard a lot of recommendations of how we can increase our education to support with this. So that will give us some time to pull some of those resources together. And then we have a little bit of a phased timeline starting in June of 2024, focusing on larger multifamily buildings and larger businesses. And then not until 2025, bringing in all city properties. We used to have a more spaced out timeline. We both heard that if we want to meet our ambitious goals, we should have a faster timeline, but also that some of our small businesses need a little bit more time. And I think from the ones we talked to that 2025 is possible, but there was also a lot of need for financial assistance. So by 2025 will allow us to also build up our resources to provide that needed assistance for businesses. And then there's a list of exemptions. So if a property generates less than 96 gallons of trash per week, if a property self-hauls, experiences economic hardship, does not have a space to add additional recycling dumpster, and if a property has identified an innovation. I want to highlight that there was a lot of support for all of these exemptions, but there was also a lot of have these exemptions, but provide as much support as possible to minimize the number of businesses using these exemptions. We talked to small businesses that currently didn't have recycling, who were very interested in it, but again, cost was a major barrier. So this isn't part of the recycling ordinance language, but we just wanted to call out the education and assistance common comments that we heard, because that was a consistent point in all conversation. A desire for increased price transparency. The city of Longmont does not serve our business community. We only serve residents in multifamily up to 8 units. So there was a desire of if us or another entity could help provide increased price transparency from our commercial haulers. Extensive mentions about financial assistance. And I have a couple examples of what that could look like. Extensive comments on education, both because there are a lot of concerns about contaminations. We even heard from 2 multifamily buildings tried recycling and contamination was so high that they had to remove it. So there's a lot of, again, that continuous need for education. And then support maybe auditing and assisting businesses and incentives for tenants and businesses. And then I skipped enforcement. So we've talked with our code enforcement, and they are able to help with auditing, so that a property may be audited for compliance by city code enforcement. And then if a property is not complying, first a warning and an opportunity to work with staff if that fines we saw from. So we also did a lot of research into what other communities were doing. So fines range from $50 to $500 for the first offense, and then from $500 to $2,000 for the second offense. And there's even some cities that were doing $2,000 a day if not complying. So we're not currently proposing any specific fine structure, but would be providing what we've seen from other communities in the conversation with council. Other communities have also required recycling plans. We were trying to be conscious of the burden this might put on some of our smaller multifamily or smaller businesses. But there's an opportunity to say you have to submit a recycling plan yearly. And we've seen in Boulder actually they kind of focused on specific industries that might have the highest levels of lack of compliance. So that could also be another way to approach that. So that's recycling. And then we have a commercial organics diversion proposal. Its commercial organic generators must divert food scraps from back of house operations through a commercial composting service and or by donating to people and or animals. Back of house, we recently saw that Boulder had to adjust their ordinance to focus more towards back of house because of high contamination. And then also because composting, I believe, is a little bit newer than recycling. So there's still a lot of education and knowledge of what that is, what goes in there. So we're giving, again, a potential timeline, a little bit of a larger, starting a little bit later. So that education period starting in June of 2024. And then we're specifically listing industries that are higher producers of food waste to be brought on, with June 2025 for some of the food wholesalers, grocery stores, and then 2027 for restaurants, food trucks, hotels. There's a huge list here. And then we also leave it open of any other businesses identified by the city. Again, this timeline could be adjusted. And then we also heard about, like, what about landscaping? What about multifamily? Due to we don't have a local composting infrastructure, there is so the timeline for those entities and the availability of composting infrastructure could make this much more financially feasible for these different entities. So this is, we wanted to include as kind of what we've heard of, like, just put it that, but with the caveat that it should be reevaluated in the future, that landscapers and those who generate yard waste could be a requirement in the future, or multifamily or construction and demolition. So just, even if the information is not finalized, to let those in the community know that if we are able to identify infrastructure or for other reasons, may evaluate other areas. Very similar exemptions, so I won't walk through them. The only difference is that it adds on-site composting. And then enforcement. So this does add an annual organics diversion plan, because we are including donation to food in our animals and not just having composting. It would probably be a little bit harder to, it's much easier to say, oh, you have a specific bin, than to know if people are doing different diversions. So this would include that annual organics diversion plan. And then also similar, lots of information and education and assistance, especially about if a lot of people are interested in, like, oh, where can I donate? What are my legal protections for donating, especially if I'm donating to people, our human consumption. So again, education assistance. So that's the overview, and I tried to highlight some of the comments and why we proposed. So let me know if there are any questions, and I can keep sharing my screen or stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you, Francie. Any questions from Ralph?
Thank you very much, Francie. Quick question. I noticed that construction and demolition had sort of been moved to the wayside, and looking at the numbers, if I read them correctly, it looked like that construction and demolition was only diverting about 6%. So they're, but I don't know what that means in terms of how much of a contributor to the waste stream that they are. So maybe they're not, and in which case pushing that back is not an issue. But do you have any information on, how much they are contributing to the waste stream, or why they're only diverting 6%, and why at this point it's being delayed in terms of addressing that? This may not be an issue, but it just kept coming up for me as I read through this.
Oh, no, that's a great question. Thank you, Ralph. Construction demolition, in terms of our opportunity to divert, I would say is the next area. It's the after commercial recycling. On from our consultant, it was commercial recycling, commercial food, and paper scraps, and then it was construction demolition. Because we're not addressing it in this ordinance, because there's not a lot of infrastructure, that there's a great need for infrastructure to support where construction and demolition can be to develop places where that can be diverted. It's also a little bit of a different mechanism. It would be going more through, I believe, our permitting process. So there is still a opportunity to develop a separate and the plan is to develop a separate construction and demolition ordinance. I believe there's also there's been, and Lisa can correct me if I'm wrong, some county discussions about different code updates, and there's been maybe some discussion about county-wide proposals around addressing construction and demolition through the code. So not forgotten, not pushed off too far, but a little bit more complicated than, or a little bit a different process than addressing the commercial. So we decided to separate it.
Sure, that makes sense. Thank you.
Robert?
Yeah, so I guess my question is, what's the strategy for outreach and education to the businesses that might be affected here? I know you're going to like teach people who are struggling, but how do they even know that this exists and is going to be something they should be complying with?
Yeah, that is a great question. That is something we still need to develop more extensively. We haven't yet made the education and outreach plan. We've had a lot of talks about building out our website and the information on our website, but it will require, I would say, extensive work going to the businesses themselves and understanding who's going to be impacted initially and going to where they are. We also have worked a lot with our partners like the Longmont Chamber, the Latino Chamber, and then on the housing side, our staff members who do the Landlords Alliance, and then also the Boulder Area Regional Housing Authority. So I would say there's a lot of different methods of getting that message out, but I believe when we spoke with Boulder, it required a lot of knocking on doors, letting people know. And I think that's also why we wanted to give that opportunity to propose not fining immediately if someone's not complying, to give a 30-day window for them to work with staff. But yes, also why we wanted to have a year-long education period as well.
Great. I've said a quick question. I was curious if there are any kind of mechanisms to try to incentivize businesses to use materials that are recyclable and compostable. Like I think about to-go containers and things like that, that we can mandate recycling, but if the items aren't really recyclable, I'm not sure where that gets. I was wondering if we have any ways to help encourage those behaviors.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question, but I see Jose Luis Ramos, our business sustainability coordinator. Jose Luis, do you want to jump in since I know you worked on the to-go-ware program?
Yeah, of course. So couple of things. I wanted to make a comment about the previous question too, and that's we do have the Sustainable Business Program, which we already have a great database of businesses that we're working with continuously. So that's one of the channels that we're planning on using too for communication, for education, for those small businesses, both in English and Spanish. Now, in terms of the to-go-ware, we just completed the introduction of a to-go-ware program. We selected some businesses, small businesses around town, different kinds of businesses, from lunch food trucks to small restaurants, where we brought in a couple of samples. We gave them a small grant so they could use some, instead of all the styrofoam, we use some aluminum compostable too, and some recyclable and compostable items, and provided to them for free so that they could use them in the next couple of months. We're going to be collecting data from that program and learning, and at the same time we're using that as an education way. One thing that it was it was not a surprise to me, but every time we went to one of those restaurants, they were using styrofoam all over the place. So it was like we took pictures of the items that we were replacing, and everything is styrofoam. So it's because, but the main thing is that's because it's the cheapest way for them. Inflation, all of those things that are affecting these businesses, it's very difficult for them to go, to compostable, because it's compostable is 3 times as much sometimes, and recyclable there's a little less cost added to it. But yeah, we started that program a couple months ago. We just finished the process, and we're collecting that in the next couple of 2 or 3 months.
That's great. Thank you. All right. Any other questions for Francie or Jose Luis? All right. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
All right. We are now heading on to the public invited to be heard. I believe, Heather, that we have some people who would like to be heard.
We do. We have Kathleen Sands with us.
Wonderful. Okay, so we will be opening this up now. You will be, if you wish to speak, you'll be unmuted, so you can speak one at a time. When it's your turn to speak, please state your name and address for the record. After you state your name and address, I'll start the timer. You'll have 3 minutes for your comment, so please try to stay within that 3 minutes, and I'll be timing you here. So, Heather, do you want to go ahead and unmute Kathleen?
Kathleen, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Should I take my video on? Should I put my video on?
No, just the microphone.
Okay. So I wanted to talk about some of the things that were in that presentation earlier. And I just learned about this meeting not very long ago, so I'm not very prepared. I apologize. But I'm Kathleen Sands at 1612 Green Place in Longmont, and I'm with Lions Climate Action Group. And I've been studying indaziflam because Boulder County just doused with a helicopter for about 4 hours last week, our open space adjacent to our town. And so I've done a lot of research about this lately. Now, what I've learned is that indaziflam is actually quite new. In fact, the EPA approved it only recently in 2020 with Andrew Wheeler, which is Trump's, the guy that Trump put in there. And so we're left with a lack of independent study confirming the long-term safety and efficacy of it. As far as increasing native plants, which obviously the pollinators need, or in decreasing fire. It's known as a neurotoxin in mammals, and in Yellowstone, the study found that it significantly reduced species richness and diversity. Maintaining biodiversity should be a priority for land managers, especially with, as far as bee pollinators and other wildlife. But regarding the control of cheatgrass, it's actually I think was what the gentleman, sorry, I can't remember his name, mentioned earlier. It's actually on the Colorado Department of Agriculture, it's a List C noxious weed. So it's not even recommended to require management for it. And the Lions Fire Chief, Pete, says he's less worried about grass and fires and more worried about managing trees so the fire doesn't go into the canopy and build intensity. Local farms use permaculture methods like goats and mow grass. Goats have been shown very effective for cheatgrass and other weeds, especially for mitigating fire. So I've got a lot of studies about this if anyone's interested. Also digging swells, plant deciduous fire mitigating trees, and building healthy soil to mitigate fire. Boulder County uses natural weed management also with near waterways. So we know that it's possible and effective. Chemical use might be easier in the short term, but in the long run, it renders the soil nearly infertile, especially indaziflam. So that's how it works. So native grasses can't grow and other plants. The Watershed Center posts on their site 2 key fire mitigating tools for land managers: prescribed burns, human interaction, or active stewardship with the forest. So not sure if Boulder County Parks and Open Space and Longmont Open Space are talking, because they seem to have a lot of fear around cheatgrass and fire. But the fire chief and some other forestry people that we've talked to, including at BLM up in Basalt, who is using a completely non-chemical management for their land, aren't worried about it. So I spoke to Matt Lopez also at the Department of Ag, and they're not worried about it either. So I'm just curious as to where they got that information from. And there was a study, he said, where in that presentation earlier, where bees were actually increased, which is the opposite of everything I've read. So I would love to see that study and how it's different from the ones I'm reading. Erosion control is also crucial, especially in Colorado, and that's exactly what we need. What happens when you spray indaziflam is it goes barren. It'll even say that on the label, and you can't even seed for 8 months to 2 years. So,
Sorry, Kathleen, your time has come up. So if you want to wrap up, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. I'm curious. I'd like to see more study. There isn't a lot of study. I think that there's lots of natural weed management plans that we should be looking at that are being used all over the country, especially for fire. And I think that we don't need to be using chemicals at all. And we don't near waterways. So if we can do it near waterways, we can do it everywhere else. And I think we should be, especially with mowing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure, I can address some of what Kathleen brought up if we have time, or if anyone would like me to.
I guess we have a couple items still that Lisa needs to get to.
Okay.
So it might be something perhaps we could. Heather can. I don't know if there's materials. Maybe Heather could help distribute after the fact.
or even
might be a little bit more comprehensive.
Yeah, or even Heather, I'm happy to, if you want to share my contact information with Kathleen, and we can talk offline.
I sure can do that. She sent a couple links that I was going to send to the board tomorrow too. So I'll send you that information as well, Jim.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. No, other Jim, sorry. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so thank you for that. So we're going to move on then to other business. So Lisa, you have both items that we have left. So
yeah, thank you all. Yeah, so the first item, so this actually was a good segue into this conversation, is that you all brought up a couple months ago about potentially wanting to revisit the structure of public invited to be heard, and how we engage with folks, or how you all engage with folks through that process. And I provided you with a number of responses from some of the conversation that you all had a couple of months ago from our legal folks in your packet for the last meeting. So I can run through those things if you all want, but I'm going to assume that you all read them. So I'm not going to do that at this moment, but we can come back to that if needed. And then you all at the last meeting did just have a couple of follow-up questions that weren't addressed in those responses, which were around, can the board ask questions of clarification of public invited to be heard speakers, and do the guidelines also apply to all public invited to be heard speakers, or just those folks that live in Longmont? So I will share the responses from our legal folks with you on those two questions, and then open it to you all for discussion of whether or not you want to change the way that you all approach public invited to be heard. And we do have one other item on the agenda, so just to keep that in mind. But so our legal representative said, with regards to questions of clarification, that really does fall still into the response category. And so they would advise against that. You all could bring that up if you chose to have a board comment section at the end, where you could discuss amongst yourselves the questions or comments that were brought up during public invited to be heard, and seek additional information through that process. That's the way that they would recommend you address that if you had a question of clarification. Or you all can always engage with folks outside of the meeting as well, and we can collect or ask for, if folks want to offer up their contact information, if you all have any specific interest and want to connect with people outside of that. And then the second question, do the guidelines apply to all public invited to be heard speakers, or just those that live in Longmont? The guidelines do apply to everyone. So we typically don't have a lot of folks coming to public invited to be heard that live outside of Longmont, but as you all have seen recently, we have had some of that. Council has had some of that as well. We do treat everyone with regards to public invited to be heard the same. And so if you chose to want to go down the route of responding to each public invited to be heard member, that would include everybody, even if they live outside of Longmont. So with that information, I will hand it all to you all to have the discussion that you want to have, and I will happily add any additional information that I have, or remind folks of some of those responses from the legal team from the last set of questions that you all had on whether or not you can expand public invited to be heard and whatnot.
Okay. Are there any, Robert?
Yeah, so from my perspective, what I've heard, or what I've understood, and I want to make sure I'm getting the right perspective here, is we have the ability in the items from the board to talk about things that were brought up at any point or not brought up on the call. So I personally like the ability to have that flexibility to, if something intriguing has been brought to the table, we want to discuss it or talk about putting it on a future meeting's agenda. I like that. I don't know that we necessarily need the ability to ask questions. I don't think that's a limiting factor for what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm not sure I have anything noteworthy to say, but that's sort of where my head is on that.
Ralph?
I'm just feeling a little unsatisfied with this, partially for two reasons. One is that I was in that situation during I made a comment at the city council and had some questions to ask, just trying to garner information on how citizens could get involved so that we could help bring some people in to help solve the problem. And the other thing is, having served, I mean, I'm new to working with Longmont, and there may not be a solution to this, so I may wind up just griping, and that's okay. I apologize if that's what it turns to. But having served on the executive committee of Watauga County in North Carolina, we did engage in, when people made presentations, we engaged in conversation. And a very important thing for me is contributing in a way that actually changes our lives. That's why I joined this committee, and engaging with people who have things that are of interest to what we're trying to accomplish is important to me personally. And again, I'm a newbie and I don't want to step out of line, but you know, it's already very restricted. On the one hand, it's almost 6 o'clock. I'd like to go have my supper, and we all have commitments, and it's a tremendous thing that all of you do, and I'm hoping to do to help our community by doing this. But I'm also concerned, and you guys may have more experience than me, about losing the opportunity to engage when the topic is fresh. I know I read all of the stuff, Lisa, a month ago. If you gave me a quiz right now, I'd score an F, you know, a month later. And I'm not sure of the solution to this. And I absolutely don't mind you guys telling me this is how it has to be. I just want to share the feeling that the community coming to us to bring a topic up, and our ability to understand that without it getting into a quagmire of administrative delays and issues is my concern. Again, understanding the time restraints and all that we need to do, it may be impossible, but I just wanted to share that. And if anybody has any thoughts, or if this is, you know, maybe not a direction to go, I'm very comfortable with that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I guess from my perspective, I do like the idea of being able to engage a little bit, because there are times where people will bring up things during the public invited to be heard that I wouldn't mind trying to follow up on. And I wonder if, because we do have the items from the board time slot, and we've moved the public invited to be heard later in the meeting, so it's not early, it seems like those things could be very close to each other. So if we could use that existing time slot, the people who do comment would probably still be able to be around by then. They wouldn't have to wait through the entire meeting. Again, I think that I'd probably score even worse than Ralph would on that exam. But it would be nice if there was a mechanism, I think, for us when we feel that it would be interesting or appropriate to kind of to try to engage while the people could still be here. I guess I don't want to get caught in the trap of feeling like we have to respond to every comment, because some of them I don't always feel are necessarily relevant to what we need to be focusing on. But some of them I find very interesting, and it would be nice to do something with the rest of the board around. I don't think I offered a solution at all, but Charles is going to come in and figure it all out. So
I'm not so sure about that. Yeah, I mean, it is a little frustrating sometimes when there's a public invited to be heard and we don't have, we have no comment except for maybe thank you. And sometimes there's things that it'd be great to follow up on. There's also sometimes when there's things that are not quite accurate, including when things have been distributed by mail, and things, for example, the expertise of the person that is being cited is overstated or
Charles, I don't know if anybody else lost the volume.
Yeah, we lost your audio, Charles.
We can't hear you.
I'll jump in a little bit with some responses while Charles troubleshoots his audio situation. Yeah, we still can't hear you, Charles. Sorry. So just a couple of things. I apologize. I should have included this in your packet again, and it didn't cross my mind to do that. So I apologize. But so just a couple of responses that with regards to the time, so there's nothing that says it has to be 3 minutes. Most boards follow that because that's the standard set by city council, but you all could change the time. You could change the length of the individual comment period as long as all members are still given the same length of time. So if you changed it to 5 minutes, everybody would have 5 minutes. That's just something also to consider for the timing of your meeting. So if you have other business to get done, there's the potential to eat into that time. It's just a consideration. If you can definitely vote to change the format of your agenda so you can incorporate time for board member responses to public invited to be heard. But again, if you're going to respond to one, you all have to respond to them all and can't pick and choose. So there's some caveats to that particular approach. It's our legal folks said that approach is not in line with proper parliamentary procedure, and part of the problem is that it's just hard to it's not clear what's meant by kind of they in the context of the board. So members address whether or not members can only address the chair, and the chair responds to the member or the public invited to be heard. There's some questions in terms of the parliamentary procedure there. And then the line that we want to be really careful of is the role of the board is to advise city council. And if you end up getting into a lot of back and forth with public invited to be heard, there's a danger in that then starting to feel like speaking for the city, and that being rather than just hearing public comment as part of your duty in terms of identifying topics and getting feedback that then you would then make recommendations or take advice to city council. And so that's a line we want to be really careful not to cross. So that's something that I think we just need to be really aware of that. So let's see, and then you can, and this is what I think the airport board ended up doing, that I shared that video clip with you all a couple of weeks ago, is that you can include the board member, council, or staff comments period. So this is going to what Jim was saying. So maybe if that period is after public invited to be heard, then you all can discuss amongst yourselves if there was something intriguing that was brought up during public invited to be heard that you want to discuss further, either in the moment or put it on a future agenda, or ask staff to bring more information back to you in a future agenda item. so that you are engaging around the topic, but not necessarily specifically engaging back and forth with the member of the public, which again then would necessitate you to do that with everybody that spoke in that period. You could also add a second public invited to be heard section in which you could have that comment period, and then there would be another opportunity for folks to then respond, which is sort of a workaround to that. And then you could also do any and all of the above. So those things are not mutually exclusive. But
Okay.
so that's kind of the recap of the information that was sent to you in your packet a couple months ago. Charles,
Okay.
did you get your audio figured out? Do you want to jump back in?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sometimes Bluetooth does some weird things. I had very similar comments to Jim, actually. So yeah, similar comments, and I think I haven't seen the airport board, but I have seen the planning commission and the way they do things, and they have a discussion amongst themselves that sometimes addresses some of the comments that were made by public invited to be heard. And I thought it was good for the board to be able to do that. It was difficult as a public invited to be heard person, though, to listen to them, because they would say things in some cases that were incorrect, but there was no ability to go back. And of course, you can't get into debate back and forth with between the public and the board members. So, but yeah.
Heather.
One thing to note as far as the planning and zoning is actually a quasi judicial board. So they have a little bit more legality kind of things in it. So I think that may be why they have more parameters to interact with the community members that way.
I mean, I guess maybe, obviously we don't have to decide forever today, but I guess maybe as a first step, I do like the idea of maybe moving the items from the board or board discussion to be directly after public invited to be heard, so that it might be a way to kind of at least try that out and see if it worked. I don't know if we need to decide now or we all want to think on it for a while, but that seems like it might be an interim step, or like a step that might get us somewhere. Charles?
Yeah, I like that, but I also, from the presentations that we get from staff, for example, or outside experts that we bring in, it's also nice to be able to discuss those. And so if you move, it depends on where, just as long as we have the items from the board after both public invited to be heard and presentations that were made, so we can comment on both of those, I'd be fine with that.
Yeah, I think usually we can comment on the presentations during the business item that is listed for the presentation. So I think
Yes.
so,
Yeah.
so
you all can absolutely engage in conversation during formal presentations under general business. Those are items that are coming to you for information and for discussion.
Yeah.
We usually ask you to hold questions till the end, just so we can get through everything. But yeah.
Yeah, and so even with the items from the board or council that we still have going, we still would be able to engage in conversations there if we felt that we needed to. So.
Okay.
All right, Ralph, and then I think we're going to need to probably scoot. So Ralph, you want to?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to understand, Jim, were you suggesting, or are we suggesting maybe moving to two things? It sounded like I heard, I just want to see, and then we could always, maybe pick this up in another meeting, that we move the public being heard to earlier in the meeting, or to the beginning of the meeting. Is that part of it?
No, that's where we used to have it, and so it recently moved to the end recently. What I was suggesting was just move the items from the board, which is just kind of like anything that any of us feel that we want to bring up, to be directly after the public invited to be heard, so that it could serve as a discussion of the public invited to be heard, not an engagement necessarily, because that's been talked about, but as a chance for us to actually talk about or ask city staff to follow up with something or more information or something like that. It might just make it a little bit easier for us to do it that, but leaving the public invited to be heard where it is.
And then we wouldn't engage with them or ask questions to them, but we would talk among ourselves if we felt it was aligned with our mission and we needed to take extra steps. We would just go from there. If we wanted to invite them back or take any other steps, we could do.
Or if we wanted Heather to help us put in touch with them so that we could follow up with them offline or something like that. Yeah.
Seems like to me a good compromise at this stage. Thank you very much.
Okay, so do we need to decide on that now, or?
It's up to you all if you want to vote on that. And again, it's not set in stone. So as you said, Jim, you all could vote on that now. We could make that change. We could try it out for a couple months. And if you decide that you want to do something different, we can talk about it again. I do want to remind you all that we don't have a December meeting because nobody ever shows up. So we wouldn't be the next opportunity to talk about it wouldn't be till January. So just to put that out there, if you all want to make a decision now, or if you want to think on it, it would be 2 months until the next meeting.
Are there any motions from the board regarding this?
I can see Charles thinking about it. I'm doing exactly the same thing.
Well, I guess my instinct would be if none of us are feeling particularly like we want to move to do something, then it should be an agenda vote item at our first meeting in January. If that tells me that none of us are feeling super strong about it.
You want to hold off?
Okay, so yeah.
And also we're missing a couple of board members, and I know we have a quorum, but at the same time, I think it'd be great to know what they're thinking too.
Okay.
Kate and Mary and
yeah,
maybe that's it.
Yeah, I think just Kate and Mary.
Okay, so do we need to move to do anything to do that, or can we just put it off till January? Okay.
Nope, you just
Great.
say, Lisa, put it on the agenda for January.
Lisa, could you please put that on the agenda for January? I'd appreciate it. And then you can also take us to the sustainability tax letter of support.
Excellent. Yes. So thank you all for that. And in the meantime, if you all have any other questions on that come up, please feel free to shoot them my way or shoot them to Heather. And then just as a reminder, we do also have the Longmont Sustainability Coalition that meets quarterly. It's a much more informal setting. And so it is a place where people, one, if you just want to come here. So Kathleen, who was here today, actually came to that meeting a couple weeks ago and shared some similar information with folks. It's much more informal. There's more discussion. So if you all want another opportunity that might be a different way to engage with other folks from the public around sustainability topics, I would encourage folks to attend that if you don't already. So the next item is the letter of support for the sustainability tax. So we've talked about this a couple of times. We need this for our grant application, which is due on Friday. So assuming that you all support this, Jim, I'll have to get with you so we can get a signature and I can get that back. But also to just make sure you all are aware where we landed on the sustainability tax project. So the 3 items that you'll see in your packet represent actually 5 projects, but they fall under these 3 topic headings. So focus on excuse me, extreme heat resilience. And so we have 2 different projects that we'll be doing that through, one of which is a building electrification demonstration project in partnership with Longmont Power and Communication. So bringing together energy efficiency and building electrification for the purpose of enhancing extreme resilience to extreme heat for low-income households. And then a heat mapping project where we'll do some real-time heat mapping in the summer of next year. So using the climate risk and vulnerability map that we've been working on to identify neighborhoods that we think would have more impact from extreme heat and those that might have less, and actually recruit folks to go out with sensors and do real-time data collection for heat index information for different neighborhoods so that we can actually compare that to what we have in our climate risk and vulnerability map. And then also use that as a community engagement tool to start talking to folks about what are effective and appropriate neighborhood-based cooling solutions would be. And then supporting the implementation of the zero waste resolution. So funding an additional school through the Green Star Schools program. So we already fund 2 schools per year. That would bump that up to 3 for next year. St. Vrain Valley School District also funds 1 additional school. And so just with that 1 additional school only for next year, that would actually put us on track to meeting our goal of having 100% Longmont schools participating in the Green Star School program by the end of 2025. So that's a good one for us. And then working with our parks folks to install big belly recycling bins at key parks locations. So if you all haven't seen those yet, they're like the solar powered kind of trash recycling combination bins that have trash compaction along with them as well. So they are going to be installing some in December, and then this allows them to accelerate installing even more. So there'll be 10 additional bins next year that they'll be doing in key parks locations across the community. And then the last one, and I apologize, I think in the version that I sent to you, I didn't drop in the little statement of description here for the wastewater solar and storage project. It's decarbonization work happening at the wastewater treatment plant. They've been doing some awesome work over there, but they got some funding from DOLO to do energy efficiency through installing some high efficiency blowers over there, and then also putting in solar PV and a battery storage system to reduce energy demand at the wastewater treatment plant. They, because of inflation and all the wonderful things we've been dealing with, have a budget shortfall in that project. And we had some extra money through this, the sustainability tax next year that was a bit higher than last year. So we are going to put a chunk of money toward that project to help them fill that gap there. So any questions with that? Otherwise, I'll let you all vote on the letter of support. And then we'll keep you all apprised as we implement those projects. Yeah, Robert.
So it's maybe just a question about that wastewater treatment plant upgrade project. Is there a master plan for the wastewater treatment facility? I tried Googling it and couldn't find what I was looking for. I was curious about those turbo blowers and whether there would be future changes to blower needs. I don't think it changes my opinion about whether this is a good use of resources, but
That's a
for
great
future investigation, I wasn't sure.
That's a great question. I'm like, Becky, I'm like, I don't know the answer to that, but Becky hopefully has information for us.
Hi, Robert. Yes, there is a master plan for the wastewater treatment plant. However, it's primarily focused on what process changes are needed to meet changing regulatory requirements. And I don't believe that there's been an update to it since the last round of regulatory requirements, but there should be a copy somewhere on the website, and I can send out a link to the group. So great question.
Any other questions or motions? Charles?
Can I move that we approve the letter of support?
Certainly can.
I move that we approve the letter of support.
All right.
I'm happy to second that.
Okay. All in favor of approving the letter of support?
Aye.
Hi.
Aye.
Awesome. Thank
It's
you all.
clean-
Jim,
clean
I'll
sweep.
work with you and Heather to get that signature. If you could get it back to me as soon as you can, that would be excellent.
Should be no problem at all. Thank you so much.
Thank
Lisa.
you.
All right. Oh, here we are at 6:17. I've failed at keeping us on time, and I apologize. Are there any items from the board? No. Any items from council that we'd like, Councilwoman Martin? Is there anything that you would like to?
No, I'm here. I just was a long way away from the unmute. But no, very interesting presentations today, but I don't have anything to add.
All right. And is it correct, Heather, that we still have no additional information attachments?
Yeah, we didn't have any attached for this month's packet, so we will in January though.
Wonderful. Well, that brings us to item number 14, which is to adjourn. So I just need a motion. Everybody wants to say? Yes? Robert?
Hey, Jim, I'd like to move that we adjourn today's meeting.
Well, that's wonderful. Does anybody like to second
I
that?
can second that.
All right, we have a second from Michelle. All in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Aye. Excellent. Thank you so much, all, and I hope you have great holidays.
Thank you all. See you in
See you in January.
January.
Yeah.
January.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.